She had just finished her shift. 17-year-old Laurel Jean Mitchell clocked out of the snack bar at Epworth Forest Church Camp on the north side of North Webster Lake. She was supposed to meet friends at the amusement park, half a mile away, 10 minutes on foot. Someone waved to her as she walked. She waved back. She was never seen alive again. The next morning, fishermen found her body in the Elkhart River. The autopsy told a brutal story. She had drowned. But she had not gone quietly. The medical examiner said she had made a violent struggle to survive. Her death was ruled a homicide. The case went cold. Decades passed. The men who killed her built lives in the same communities where they had ended hers. And then, 47 years after the crime, a DNA sample from clothing preserved in an evidence bag cracked everything wide open. Fred Bandy Jr. is now in prison for the rest of his life. And Laurel Jean Mitchell's sister says she doesn't care if she ever hears his name again. Welcome back. Today we're going to Noble County, Indiana, a rural stretch of the state northeast of Indianapolis, where a 17-year-old girl walked off a church camp job one summer night in 1975 and was found drowned in a river the next morning. The case would stay cold for nearly half a century. The suspects would age into their 60s. And the only reason any of this got solved is because a laboratory preserved a piece of evidence for 44 years and kept testing it when technology allowed. This is the story of Laurel Jean Mitchell, the two men who took her life, and the detective work that finally brought one of them to a courtroom in 2024. It was a Wednesday evening in August. Laurel Mitchell was 17 years old, the kind of age where summer feels both endless and important, where you work a job and plan your nights around your friends. Laurel worked at the snack bar at Epworth Forest, a church camp and resort on North Webster Lake in Kosciuszko County. It was honest, ordinary summer work. She finished her shift at 10 o'clock that night and set out on foot. The plan was simple: meet up with friends at an amusement park about half a mile away. It was a familiar route. It should have taken minutes. Someone who knew her saw her walking along the road. They waved. She waved back. And then she disappeared. When Laurel didn't come home that night, her parents called the police. The next morning, August 7th, fishermen on the Elkhart River made a grim discovery. At the Mallard Roost public access site on County Road 600 North in Noble County, they found Laurel Jean Mitchell. She was dead. Her cause of death was drowning, but the autopsy report told investigators something more. Laurel Mitchell had not been held gently. She had made a violent struggle before she died. She had fought for her life with everything she had. Her death was ruled a homicide. The investigation began. In 1975, the tools available to investigators were limited. There was no DNA testing. Forensic science was not what it is today. Cases of this kind were solved, when they were solved at all, through witnesses, confessions, and circumstantial evidence. The investigation turned up some information. There were names, people in the community who might know something, but nothing that built into a case that could go to court. The years passed. The file stayed open, technically, but it went nowhere. Laurel's sister Sarah was 12 years old when it happened. She grew up carrying that night with her. And what made it harder, she would later say, was not just the grief. It was the uncertainty. The knowledge that someone out there had killed her sister and was walking around free. For decades, the family had no answers. What they didn't know, what no one outside a small circle knew, was that in the years and decades after Laurel's murder, at least 3 people in northern Indiana had heard something, had been told something, and had sat with that knowledge through the years. Incriminating statements, made by 2 men, over and over, across time, to people who were too afraid or too unsure to go to the police. Fred Bandy Jr. and John Wayne Lehman were young men in the summer of 1975. They were both teenagers or barely out of their teens, part of the community around North Webster Lake. In the years that followed Laurel Mitchell's murder, Bandy's life took predictable turns for a violent man. He was convicted of sex crimes not once, but multiple times in Noble Circuit Court over the decades. He was registered as a sex offender. Each conviction, each registration, each arrest put more of his DNA into law enforcement databases. He was living in Goshen, not far from where Laurel had worked and died, building a life, in plain sight, in the same part of the state. Lehman was in Auburn, same region, same proximity. In the meantime, those who had heard what the two men had said over the years, the incriminating statements, the admissions, stayed quiet, until, at some point, at least one of them did not. A tip, investigators would later say, had come in about a decade before the arrest. A tip that put Lehman in the frame, but a tip alone, without physical evidence, is not enough for a murder charge. The case needed science. Here is the thing about physical evidence. It waits. Evidence collected in 1975, clothing, samples from the crime scene had been preserved by the Indiana State Police. Not because anyone thought it would take 44 years, but because the protocol existed, someone followed it, and a sealed evidence bag sat in storage for nearly half a century. In 2019, investigators submitted that clothing to the Indiana State Police Laboratory Division for renewed DNA testing. The technology had come a long way since 1975. Further than anyone in 1975 could have imagined. A DNA profile was developed from what was found on the clothing. The profile existed, but to be useful, it had to match someone. In December 2022, 47 years after Laurel's murder, Fred Bandy Jr. voluntarily provided a DNA sample to Indiana State Police. Voluntarily, it isn't clear what he thought the sample would or wouldn't show. What is clear is the result. Testing determined that Bandy was 13 billion times more likely to be the contributor of the DNA found on Laurel Mitchell's clothing than any other unknown person on Earth. 13 billion to 1. On February 6, 2023, 47 years, 5 months, and 31 days after Laurel Jean Mitchell walked away from that church camp snack bar, Indiana State Police arrested Fred Bandy Jr. at his home in Goshen. The same day, they arrested John Wayne Lehman in Auburn. Both were 67 years old. Both were charged with 1 count of murder. Both were held without bond at the Noble County Jail. At a press conference, Indiana State Police Captain Kevin Smith described what investigators believed had happened that August night in 1975. Bandy and Lehman had picked up Mitchell as she walked along the road. They had put her in Bandy's 1971 Oldsmobile. They had driven her to the Mallard Roost access site on the Elkhart River. And then, they had drowned her. The same river where fishermen found her body the next morning. The same access point. The same quiet stretch of northern Indiana water turning black at night. For the family, the call came 47 years after the crime. "I was just shocked," Laurel's sister Sarah Nisley said. "You could have just knocked me over. When they got a match on the DNA, that was just amazing." The two men had very different paths through the legal system. John Wayne Lehman negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for his testimony against Bandy, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, a lesser charge. In an August 2024 deposition, he told investigators what happened on that road in 1975. He said Bandy raped Mitchell. He said Bandy drowned her. He said his own fear of Bandy had kept him from stopping it. On October 11, 2024, Lehman was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Fred Bandy Jr. did not accept a deal. His bench trial, tried before a judge, not a jury, concluded on October 9, 2024, 49 years, 2 months, and 3 days after Laurel John Mitchell fought for her life in the Elkhart River. The judge found Fred Bandy Jr. guilty of first-degree murder. On October 22, 2024, a Noble County judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole, the sentence structure Indiana law required in 1975, before life without parole existed on the books. In practice, Fred Bandy Jr. is 69 years old. He will die in prison. In July 2025, the Indiana Court of Appeals reviewed Bandy's conviction. They upheld it. Sarah Nisley was 12 years old when her sister didn't come home from the church camp job. She spent 49 years carrying that. When the verdict came in, when the judge said guilty, Sarah was in the courtroom. "It was awesome to hear," she said afterward. "It was a sigh of relief. It's over." But the relief was not simple. "It was all the years he got to live free that really irritates me," she said. That he got to live a life and have kids, and all the things she did not get to do. And when Bandy's conviction was upheld on appeal, when the door finally, completely, legally closed, Sarah didn't dwell. "To me, he's gone. Good riddance. And I don't care if I ever hear his name again." There are a few things in this case that deserve to be named. First, the clothing. Someone in 1975 sealed it into evidence and wrote on the bag and put it on a shelf. They didn't know DNA technology would exist. They didn't know it would take 44 years before anyone could use it properly. They just did what the protocol said to do. That single act is the reason this case was solved. Second, the witnesses. 3 people had heard incriminating statements from Bandy and Lehman over the course of decades. People who were teenagers in 1975 and grew into adults with that knowledge. At some point, at least one of them spoke. Third, the DINA unit. The Indiana State Police cold case team submitted that clothing in 2019. They built a profile. They kept working. They matched Bandy's voluntary sample in 2022. That was not a lucky break. That was a system doing what it was built to do. And fourth, Fred Bandy Jr. had continued committing sexual offenses for decades after killing Laurel Mitchell. He had been convicted multiple times in the same courts that would eventually sentence him for her murder. His crimes after 1975 put his DINA into the system that eventually identified him. He couldn't outrun the record of who he was. The Mallard Roost public access site on County Road 600 North in Noble County is still there. A river access point in rural Indiana, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know the story. Laurel Jean Mitchell was 17. She waved at someone she knew on her way to meet her friends. Fred Bandy Jr. is in prison for life. Her sister Sarah has nothing left she wants to say about the man who took her. Subscribe if you're new here. New episodes every. Drop a comment below. And as always, the names deserve to be remembered. Laurel Jean Mitchell. North Webster, Indiana, August 6, 1975.